Welcome to Chapter 5, Section 1. Our objective, learn to solve an equation using a proportion. And our essential question for today, what is a proportion? Vocabulary terms we'll need to know: ratio, equivalent ratio, and proportion. Let's start with a ratio. A ratio is a comparison of two quantities by division. In one rectangle, the ratio of shaded squares to unshaded squares is 7 to 5. That means there are 7 blue to 5 white. In the other rectangle, the ratio is 28 to 20, 28 blue to 20 white. Both rectangles have equivalent shaded areas. Ratios that make the same comparison are equivalent ratios. So even though the numbers are different, 7 to 5 and 28 to 20 are equivalent ratios because they cover the same amount of area, just matched up in different size squares. Ratios can be written in several different ways. You will be asked about this, so make sure you write down the 3 different ways. With the word 2, 7 to 5, with a colon, which is still pronounced 7 to 5, and like a fraction, which is also pronounced 7 to 5. Find two ratios that are equivalent to each given ratio. This is essentially review. Looking at the ratios the way they're written, like fractions, we're finding equivalent fractions. That means we can reduce them or we can increase them by the same amount. So one option would be to double it, multiply both numbers by 2. 18/54 is equivalent to 9/27. We could divide both numbers by 9, we get 1/3. You could go on and find an infinite amount of answers because you can multiply by anything you want to, and you can only divide if they have common factors. Let's try 64/24. To get an equivalent ratio, multiply both numbers by 2, 128 over 48. Another option, divide by a number. 8 goes into both numbers, so we get 8/3. Notice that we keep them always as fractions because that's the way a ratio is written. Let's try it again. Find two ratios that are equivalent to each given ratio. 8/16. That should look familiar to you. Hopefully you can recognize something common about those. We could multiply both by 2, 16/32. We could divide both by 4 and get 2/4. It's also equivalent to 1/2. 32/16 multiplied by 2, 64/32. Divide by 8, 4/2, or equivalent to 2 over 1. So what's a proportion? A proportion is an equation, which means it has an equal sign, that states that two ratios are equivalent. Ratios that are equivalent are said to be proportional. Equivalent ratios are identical when they are written in simplest form. So we're looking, for example, at something like this. To give you a basic one, 4/8 we know is the same as 1/2. If we were to write it out like that, we would say that those numbers are proportional. One of the things we're looking for is that both fractions reduce to the same thing. Well, because we know that 4 over 8 both divide by 4, that's equal to 1/2, so we know they're the same fraction. Let's simplify to tell whether the ratios form a proportion. So we have two ratios, 3/27 and 2/18. Take them one at a time. Simplify means we have to divide both by the same common factor. So we know 3 and 27 are both divisible by 3. We get 1/9. Do 2/18 separately. Those are both divisible by 2. We get 1/9. Because they came out to be the same, 3/27 and 2/18 are proportional. Let's do the same for 12/15 and 27/32. 12 divided by 3 and 15 divided by 3. 4/5. 27/36, both divisible by 9. 3/4, and they are both simplified as far as possible, and they are different, so they are not in proportion. There's a second method we could use to determine if ratios form a proportion. We're going to use these same fractions. So we have 3/27 and 2/18. What I want to do is I want to start by putting them equal to each other and checking. So rather than simplifying fractions, because I know we don't always like to do that, instead of simplifying these ratios, we're going to do what's called a cross product. Product means multiply, cross means diagonal. So we start by taking 3 times 18. Well, remember, 3 times 18 is 54. Then we multiply the other diagonal, 27 times 2, and 27 times 2 is 54. So because those two numbers came out to be the same, these two ratios are in a proportion. Let's try 12/15 and 27/32. Now these numbers are large, but you can multiply with a calculator or you can do it by hand. So we multiply 12 times 36, and that equals 432. And then we multiply 15 times 27, which is 405. 5, sorry, kind of messy. They did not come out equal, so these are not a proportion. And we saw those same results when we did them with simplifying. Cross products are fun. We get to multiply, we don't have to simplify fractions, and we're going to be using cross products for the entire second half of the chapter, so it's really important to learn how to use them now. That's it for lesson 1. Make sure your notes are filled out completely. Write some questions on the left-hand side, maybe about how you determine if something is a proportion, if these two ratios are proportional, things that will give you back the definition of that word proportion. Review your notes, highlight, summarize, chunk them, and complete the summary before class.